We have a lot to cover today. I think it's going to be an exciting session, and so let's get to the science of it. So just as a kind of brief introduction, a recent study just last month actually, which was done by scientists from the European Commission, Monica Kripa and her colleagues, and also the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, estimated, did an updated calculation, estimated that roughly a third of greenhouse gas emissions are from the food supply. So they found about 71% of those emissions were from the land-based sector, that is livestock and land use changes and agriculture, of course. The food system emissions have increased since 1990, from about 16 gigatons in 1990 to 18 gigatons, so a 12.5% increase. But the share of global greenhouse gas emissions has decreased over time, so 44% in 1990 compared to 34% in 2015. While global food production increased by 40%. So this does indicate an decrease of emissions intensity. Nevertheless, the contributions are still significant, and that's why we focus today on how they may be reduced. There are currently many efforts and scientific studies underway to manage this issue, and a lot of companies have been looking at this approach of regenerative agriculture. Can mention just a few, and I'm sure there are many, many others, but General Mills, ADM, Cargill, Danone, Kellogg, Mars have major programs. I think I've understood today PepsiCo just announced a additional major regenerative agriculture program, building on their earlier efforts. So a lot of efforts are underway, but this still needs a lot more attention around the world. It's still a relatively small part of total agriculture. Independent farmers are also taking this approach, and there's a lot of work going on reducing methane. We're going to hear some of the scientific work and all the work on thousands of dairies and livestock farmers around the world working on the methane side of it. Of course, for some of you, this may be an introduction for the first time to the soil microbiome. You'll be hearing a bit about that, but there's probably a need for more research in tropical areas and metrics for measuring progress. So today we're very lucky to have top global experts from New Zealand, California, France, Ohio, Canada, and Brazil to present and discuss these measures that could be taken, the science is underway, and the innovation needed to meet these challenges. So let me, without further ado, introduce the first speaker, Dr. Jeremy Hill, the Vice President of Fonterra, which is the New Zealand Dairy Cooperative, one of the largest in the world. And he's also the past president of the International Dairy Federation. So he's going to talk about metrics for sustainability in dairy and the latest science. Please, Dr. Hill.
Okay, so is my screen showing? Okay,
yes,
so
we can see it perfectly. Yeah.
All right, thank you for this opportunity. Really delighted to be able to be sharing today the work that we've done around greenhouse gas assessments across our chain. It's work that's applicable globally, and I want to talk particularly around what we've done to help develop common methods, the application of those methods in our chain, and how we're then using the information that has given us to make improvements. Those improvements are in farming practices, but they're also giving us a strong indication of where we need to put in place mitigation technology, particularly around methane, which we're going to come to. Now, in presenting the data I'm going to present today, I want to make the point that we have done the accountancy, so the calculations in CO2 equivalents, if you want, on the basis of the way that the New Zealand government measures its inventory and how that is part of its commitment to the Paris Agreement. Now, as the speaker following me will clearly show, that's only one way of doing the accountancy. There are other ways that, quite frankly, are probably better, a better way of reflecting particularly the global warming impacts of methane. And again, as you'll see as I take you through this presentation, you'll see why that is particularly important when we look at the emissions from livestock chains and indeed the dairy chain. The other thing we'll hear later today is around the importance of soil organic carbon, the soil microbiome, and why that's important. Again, because of the accountancy system that is used, you're not going to see that as part of my presentation either. But I can tell you that we are very actively involved both in New Zealand and internationally in looking at how we can make those assessments and include those within the accountancy system that's used. Now, I cannot see for some reason the forward button's disappeared from my screen.
So just click on the presentation and then you should be able to use your arrow keys to advance.
The presentation has actually jumped to another screen for me. Can you see as it changed?
No, it looks perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, no, the slide changed.
All right. So just very briefly, for those who are not familiar with Fonterra, we're a dairy cooperative. We're owned by 10,000 New Zealand dairy farmers. We produce a lot of milk at peak. The peak day for milk production in New Zealand, we produce over 80 million litres of milk a day from those 10,000 dairy farms, which goes to one of 29 factories that we have in New Zealand. And we produce around about 2 million tonnes of dairy products a year. And then the reason I say tons of dairy products is that the majority of milk in New Zealand is processed into products that are exported to one of 130 markets around the world. New Zealand is very, very atypical for many dairy nations in terms of our emissions profile as a result of, as you'll see, a low population and a significant amount of dairy production, 95% of which is exported. Okay, I am having a problem with
I would recommend just try using your mouse instead.
I am doing. It's okay. It's just really slow. I'm sorry. It's for some reason there's a big delay. So my apologies to the audience. I seem to be able to not do anything about that. So what you see here, and very briefly, is the work that we've done to support the analysis. First and foremost, we did some work in 2008 involving the University of New South Wales, Scion, which is the Forestry Research Institute here in New Zealand. They had a set of skills, and Agri-Research, which is our pastoral research institute in New Zealand. Both Scion and Agri-Research are government-owned research institutes. Together, those three organisations working with Fonterra developed one of the first, if you want, more comprehensive LCAs for a large dairy chain. We took that methodology, we're very actively involved in IDF New Zealand, and we took that methodology to the IDF to see whether that could be incorporated and developed into an international standard or guideline, which was done in 2010. It was updated in 2015, and we are now working on updating that guidance to try and incorporate soil organic carbon methodologies as well. Having helped develop a common method, and this is really important because if everybody's using different methods, what do the results really mean? Having helped develop that common method, we then started applying it very early. So in the 2010-2011 season, we started an 8-year study which we published in January of 2020, looking at 368 benchmark farms that we'd monitored around New Zealand over that period, to try and determine what the emissions were from those farms and what was the source of those emissions. This year, we've taken the approach out to all of our supplier farms to provide them with information on their emissions. And I'll come back to that later to show how we're providing guidance and how they can change their farming practices in order to improve those emissions. And I'll try and, there we go, that's a bit quicker. So just covering at a global level and a New Zealand level, what that's told us. Well, we just heard that roughly a third of emissions are coming from agriculture. We would be in agreement with that. I think given the, and I would caution this very strongly, given the accuracy of which we can do this, I would say they're in the range of 20 to 30%. And we'll definitely come back to some of the difficulties of measuring emissions as part of this this session, I'm sure. But within reason, that they're around 20 to 30%. FAO had it at 24% from previous figures that I've incorporated here. Of that, 2.7% of global emissions are from the production of milk. 4% if you include the meat that comes from the dairy chain as well. Now, again, my comment here is as determined in carbon equivalents, and a big impact on that is how you account for methane, and Frank's going to cover that in some detail later. The next point I want to make is, what does that look like in New Zealand? Well, firstly, New Zealand is a very small contributor to global emissions at 0.16%. The reason for that is we have a tiny population. So New Zealand population is 5 million. We've actually got 5 million cows in New Zealand. So we've got the same number of people as cows, or cows as people, if you want. And as I said, most of that's exported. And I'll come to what that means about our emissions, our detailed emissions profile in a second. About half of our emissions are agriculture, and about half of agricultural emissions in New Zealand are dairy. When we look at what is driving that, around 85% of those dairy emissions are coming from the farm, getting closer to 90%, quite frankly. Of those emissions, 70% is enteric methane. Again, on the basis of the accountancy used. So jumping into that New Zealand context, we have a very atypical profile because of our lack of population and lack of industry, quite frankly. So what you see is the emissions profile in this pie chart for New Zealand. And from that, you can see that in aggregate, energy is around 41% of our emissions, and agriculture is around 48%. Now that is very, very atypical for a developed economy. Ireland would probably be the next at around 30%. But in Ireland, I think dairy contributes around 10%, unlike New Zealand, where it's closer to 25%. And because Fonterra is around 80% of the dairy industry in New Zealand, Fonterra's contribution, primarily through our shareholder farmers, is around 20%. Now, that's still only 0.03% of global emissions. So these are big numbers in New Zealand, little numbers globally. Nevertheless, because of that 48% for New Zealand to meet its Paris agreements, it must include agriculture. And therefore, there is a strong focus on making improvements to our emissions profile, certainly in energy, which you see is still significant, but also from agriculture. Now, in an aggregate, on a yearly basis, the cows in New Zealand actually produce a lot of methane. And I worked out that that would fill 8,000 grass zeppelins if you were to capture that methane. Now, the problem is that that methane is produced in a very diffuse and dispersed way. So each cow only produces roughly 1 balloon of methane per hour, or around 230 grams per day. Now, the important point is the 230 grams of methane, because as Frank will show later, how you turn that into carbon equivalents makes a big difference. But using the New Zealand accountancy system, that gives us about 0.78 kilos of carbon equivalent per litre of fat and protein corrected milk. And the international standard way of doing this is to correct for the solids content in your milk, or the nutrition the milk is providing, which makes somewhat sense. Globally, of course, the emissions that are represented in that 2.7% of emissions that dairy contributes to global total, the average is 2.5 kilos of CO2 equivalent. And so that there is a big difference between the average and some of the practices out there. New Zealand tending to be at the leading edge of those practices. So coming back to that 0.78 kilos per litre of fat and protein corrected milk, where does that come from? Well, as I mentioned before and showed in summary, most of that is enteric methane. We've got a split of where the methane comes from, a split of where the nitrous oxide comes from, where the CO2 comes from, all the inputs, all the outputs on these 368 benchmark farms that we followed for those 8 years. Now, the important point about 8 years is, in particularly the system that we use, which is almost 100% outdoor grazing for the entire year, you can be subject to significant climate impacts year to year. So in order to get an accurate representation of what our footprint was, we've published this study over an 8-year period. Since publishing the study, we've continued to do it actually. So each year we're continuing to do this analysis. And as I'll show later, we've rolled this out to all 10,000 of our farms now. Another important point is we did the benchmark farms, and in fact, as you'll see later, the total supply spans the length and breadth of New Zealand, and that's from what we call Northland to Southland. Very easy names to remember. And the key point about Northland is it's subtropical in its climate, and Southland's subantarctic. It's a huge difference in climate. Nevertheless, we didn't see a great difference in emissions between those regions. Northland tended to be a bit higher, and the reason for that is it tends to have a little bit more broad-in feed, and as you'll see, that can make quite a big impact on that emissions profile. So looking at this, we also found between the top quartile performers, or the lowest quartile, if you want to think about it from a methane or greenhouse gas production perspective, and those farms that are producing the highest levels, there wasn't a great deal of difference actually, if you looked at it on a quartile basis. But what we did find is in those bottom set of charts, really what is driving some of the differences. So the efficiency of milk production or milk solids production on the farm, you can see makes a big difference. The application of fertilizer makes a big difference, and particularly the excess nitrogen that can get converted to nitrous oxide, and also brought in feed, as I mentioned before. In the last year of the study, we also expanded that to 7,146 of our farms, just to see how representative those benchmark farms were going to be. And we got an almost identical result. And we got an almost identical result because actually there wasn't a great deal of difference. In fact, there was very, very little difference between the benchmark farm average data and the broader number of farms that we analyzed. And although down the bottom, you can see what looks like a 10% difference in brought-in feed, I need to put that in context because 96% of the feed consumed on New Zealand farms is homegrown. So actually, it's only 10% of 4%, in other words, 0.4%. So it's not a really big difference between the benchmark farms and that broader set of farms that we analyzed. The important point, and getting to where you get change, is you need to then get relevant information to all of your farmers, because they are the ones that will be making improvements the management practices. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And the people that are managing it, given the majority of our emissions in the chain are on farm, are the farmers. So a key aspect of what we've done this year is to take all this down to the farm level and provide the farmer with a bespoke report for his farm. The key thing about that report is it takes account of his performance or her performance in terms of managing their farm and compares that with two things: the average farm for the region they're in and similar farms to theirs in the Fonterra supply. So they get an idea of, if you're farming this way, how do you look? If you're farming in this region, how do you look? And then we provide a dashboard of where the improvements can be made. For example, we think you've got an opportunity in brought-in feed, fertilizer application, perhaps even stocking rate, etc. Once the farmer's got that information, and particularly over these next few years, we have a series of consultations with those farmers through our farm advisory service. We've got bespoke, sustainable farming advisors that we employ that go in and help the farmer with those improvements. So it's been really, really pleasing to see how we've been able to engage at that global level to help develop a common approach, to apply that approach to see what data it's given us for New Zealand. In fact, the FAO also applies that approach to give a common view globally, and then to be able to take that down to each individual farm. And again, I'll come back to the point I made at the start. We can easily change the warming impacts, and particularly of methane, if we're to introduce new measures. We can easily account for carbon. Well, we can't easily account for carbon, but we could account for carbon in the soil if that becomes part of the accountancy system as well. So, but at the moment, we're following essentially the accountancy rules used by the New Zealand government in making its commitments. What we do know is management practices will probably only take us so far. And even if you have a balance, taking account of regenerative practices, soil organic carbon, etc., you still have the potential to make an impact on global warming by reducing methane and nitrous oxide for that matter, which is why since 2001, Fonterra has also been investing in the development of mitigation technologies. So a raft of things that we can do to inhibit particularly the production of methane, given, as you saw, that's 70% of our emissions. Very early on, we saw the attractive potential of a vaccine. So we've been investing for over 20 years in the development of a vaccine. It's very, very difficult because this is a different way of getting a vaccine to work. We're trying to essentially vaccinate an animal through the blood to get an impact on the methanogens in the rumen. It's quite a challenge. Over the last few years, we've brought together the best vaccine minds in the world, and certainly in livestock, to help us with this. But it's still quite a challenging task. However, the great thing about the vaccine is you could see this being applied in both smallholder and in scale livestock production. So we'll still keep trying with this particular approach, difficult as it is. There's a range of chemical inhibitors that are and an increasing number being produced that are showing potential. The key point, coming back to the earlier slide though, is at this point in time, you've only got 17 cents per cow per day, US, to have a solution for 100% of that methane reduction. If you were to get to something more like 50% or 25%, those numbers are obviously much lower. So these solutions need to be really, really cost effective as well, of course, practical. And the way I like to describe that, yes, they've got to be good for the planet, but they've also got to be good for the farmer. They've got to be good for the cow's health, and they've got to be good for the milk in terms of residues and milk production and so on and so forth from the consumer end. We're working on a number of quite radical technologies as well. These are closer to rocket science and dairy science, quite frankly. There's a whole range of natural inhibitors. Seaweed, red seaweed is well publicized, and I know Davis, the next speaker from Davis has been actively involved in doing that research. And then another area is using cultures. Of course, the rumen is a large microbiome, in order to try and modify the rumen microbiome through either cultures or fermentations. And Fonterra has tens of thousands of cultures that we've collected since the 1920s in order to make a range of dairy products, cheeses, yogurts, sour creams, etc. Early in the early 2000s, we mined for probiotic activity for human applications, and now we're doing the same to look at applications in creating fermentations, which we call in kombucha, to potentially mitigate methane. Some promising results there, but again, a long way to go before we will be confident that that would be a practical solution for animals. The last point I want to make is that greenhouse gas is only one part of the food system. It's not the only thing you need to address. There are lots of other aspects. It is a very complicated system from a socio-economic and environmental perspective, and there's a lot of these that are important, and you need to take those into account. So one of the other things that I do, and I have the privilege of doing, I have a professorship at university, which is literally across the road from Fonterra's Research and Development Center, where I helped establish this thing called the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, and I do invite you to go visit the site. I'm not going to go through the information in this presentation, but there's a whole raft of information around the food system and how it provides nutrients in particular, because a key concept of the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative is nutrition comes first. Any system that fails to provide the minimum requirements of the key nutrients, and we've modeled 29 of them in the work that we've done, to all of the global population cannot be sustainable. So you must have that provision. And dairy, without going into details, is a critical part of that system at the moment. And actually provides a weighted around 17% of global nutrient provision, 17%, which is why it is so important to do these measurements, and it's why it's so important to introduce these management practices to make the improvement in the way that we produce milk, mitigation technologies to reduce that footprint as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hill. Very interesting presentation. A lot of really interesting work going on, and these techniques for measuring are quite important, and I think some of them are available publicly, so other dairy farmers around the world might adopt some of those. So thank you very much. I think we will leave the questions until we come to the panel discussion at the end. So maybe better to move right to the next presentation. So our second speaker is Dr. Frank Mitloehner, professor at the University of California at Davis, where he's director of the CLEAR Center, which works on animal agriculture and the environment. He was formerly the co-chair of the FAO Livestock Environmental Assessment Performance Partnership, LEAP, which still continues looking at the environmental impact of livestock. So he'll be speaking on the important developments in animal agriculture and the implications for emissions. So Dr. Mitloehner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure for me to be here with you today and share some information about, particularly about methane, because in my opinion, methane is really one of the really big deals in and around animal agriculture right now. Just give me an okay that you can see my slide and you can see me. Is that the case?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So my disclosures are mentioned here. Yeah, I've been here in Davis since 2002, and California has a very large dairy sector. We produce 20% of the US milk. Our dairies are rather large, 1,500 cows probably on average. Some of them are 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 cows per operation. And so different from the pastoral system in New Zealand, but I love to see what you had to say there, Geoffrey. If you...
Sorry, Dr. Mitloehner, sorry to interrupt. Can you maybe put your slides on full screen? They're a bit small.
The reason why they are small is because I have a really large screen. That's probably why.
Okay, if it can't be helped.
Yeah, I think that's the reason why.
Okay.
Okay, so if you're on Twitter, then please follow me. My handle is GHGGuru. Here at UC Davis, we also have my center, the Clear Center, represented on Twitter at UC Davis Clear. I put a video together with my center called Rethinking Methane, and you find that on YouTube. It's freely available, and it only takes 5 minutes to watch. I think it breaks down this whole issue very nicely, and I encourage you to go watch it and share it. So really briefly, for those of you who don't deal with methane and with other greenhouse gases often, why do we care about these gases? Well, it all starts with the sun, which radiates solar radiation to the surface of the Earth. Normally, that radiation would be reflected back into space if there weren't these greenhouse gases that kind of retain that solar radiation and the related warming in our atmosphere. So without these greenhouse gases, life on Earth would not be possible. It would be too cold here. So we need greenhouse gases. But the problem is we are producing too many of them. And so imagine this layer of greenhouse gases almost like a blanket over your body on a cool summer evening, where that blanket helps you to stay warm. That's what these greenhouse gases do. They keep us warm by retaining solar heat in our atmosphere. Most climate scientists will tell you that the main culprit with respect to compound causing human related greenhouse gas or climate change is CO2, carbon dioxide. But some people, particularly those who are not fond of animal agriculture, will say, no, we should focus on methane. And indeed, methane is a potent climate pollutant. There's no question about that, but there's a lot more nuance, which I will talk about in my speech. When looking at greenhouse gases and comparing them to one another, then a unit is used called GWP 100, Global Warming Potential 100. It compares methane and nitrous oxide to CO2. So if something, let's say a dairy produces 10 tons of methane, all you need to do is multiply the 10 tons, the 10 times this factor, the 28, and then you arrive at 280 CO2 equivalent CO2 equivalent units of methane. So 280 CO2 equivalent tons. The same is true for nitrous oxide. So that's a factor that you need to use in order to arrive at a value that compares it to CO2. This unit has been used since 1990. And it's actually okay to be used if methane goes up. If methane increases, then GWP 100 does a rather good job, an okay job. But when methane sources stay stable or when they decrease, then GWP 100 has a problem, and with it, all of us. Let me explain more how methane is different from other greenhouse gases. So if you produce CO2 or nitrous oxide, these are gases that only have sources, but there's no real process that destroys these gases. Okay? But for methane, that's different. Methane has both sources and sinks. Please remember that, sources and sinks. And they're depicted on this slide here. On the left, you see various sources of methane, including fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, biomass burning wetlands, and so on, amounting to a global total of 558, let's call it 560 teragrams of methane per year. This is where most people stop the discussion, even though they shouldn't, because methane is not just produced, but it's also destroyed. On the right side, you see that there are very large sinks for methane, amounting to almost 550 teragrams. So 560 are produced, 550 are destroyed, leaving a total of 10 teragrams behind. And that is the amount that we have to deal with. Okay, that's still an amount we want to reduce. And again, methane is an important greenhouse gas, but it's important to know that there is, and remember that, an atmospheric removal process of methane. An atmospheric removal process of methane. And this GWP 100 unit that's currently being used is not taking that into consideration in the way it should. GWP 100 acts as if methane were only produced but not destroyed, when indeed that is wrong. And you can see on the right side here a large arrow pointing downwards. And underneath it says sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. What that is referring to is a process called hydroxyl oxidation, a process by which radical molecules in the atmosphere attack methane and steal some hydrogen away from the methane, and that destroys methane. And that generally happens in around 10 years or so. So this aspect of atmospheric removal affects the lifespan of methane, because that methane is literally taken out, and it happens after approximately 1 decade. So while CO2 and nitrous oxide have a lifespan of 100 or 1,000 years and are long-lived climate pollutants, methane is not. It is both produced and destroyed, which causes a very short lifespan of approximately a decade. This is important, as you will see in the next couple of slides. Before I go into describing methane in more detail, just a little idea as to how the livestock-related methane is different from, let's say, fossil fuel-related carbon sources. So where does that methane, that CH4 that animals belch out or that comes from their manure, where does it come from? Well, it comes from a process we're all familiar with called photosynthesis. What do plants need to grow? They need sunlight, they need water, and they need a source of carbon. And that carbon they get from the air. Atmospheric CO2 makes it during photosynthesis into our plants, and the plants convert that CO2 into either cellulose, which is the world's most abundant biomass, or into starch. A bovine now comes along and eats that above ground material here, and with the cellulose, let's say, converts some of that carbon into methane gas. That methane gas that's belched out or coming from the manure is not new carbon added to the atmosphere. It is not additional carbon added to the atmosphere, but it is a recycled form of carbon, because that carbon on the right side here in the methane originates on the left side from atmospheric CO2. So this is not new and additional carbon added to the atmosphere. What happens to that methane is that after approximately 10 years, it's converted into CO2 again through a process called oxidation. To be scientifically correct, it's called hydroxyl oxidation. So you might now say, well, why is that a good thing? Didn't you just say methane has a lifespan of 10 and CO2 1 over 1,000 years? Yes. And this is not a question of good or bad. It's just a question of whether or not a stable livestock herd, adds additional new carbon to the atmosphere and hence new warming to our climate. And the answer to that is no, they do not. Stable herds do not increase warming, because the amount of methane produced and the amount of methane destroyed through this atmospheric removal process are in balance. If we increase herd size, then we add new additional methane to the atmosphere, and we don't want that. But if we, through whatever means, reduce methane, then something beautiful happens, and I will show you that in the next couple of slides. On the livestock side, we see carbon cycling from the atmosphere through the plants, through the animals, back into the atmosphere, and so on. This process goes on and on and on and is circular. How is this process different or similar to, let's say, fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are oil, coal, and gas, originally forests and dinosaurs and so on, that died, decayed, fossilized, accumulate in the ground for a very long time, hundreds of millions of years. And then over the last 70 years, 70 that is, we humans extracted about half of all that carbon and we burned it. And now all that carbon that was down there is in the atmosphere because cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, power plants, and so on brought it there. This is not a short cycle of 10 years or so. This is a one-way street where fossil carbon made it into the atmosphere. And this fossil carbon related CO2 is accumulating at a very fast pace. So just to contrast these two, on the left side, you see the fossil fuel situation, carbon fuels, carbon that was stored in the form of fossil fuels were down there. We unlocked them by drilling or digging them out, and then we're adding this ancient carbon to the atmosphere. On the livestock side, you have atmospheric CO2, which makes it during photosynthesis into our plants. Some of it stays above ground. The majority goes below ground into first the roots and then into the soil, a process called soil carbon sequestration. Please remember, about 1/3 of all human-caused carbon is stored in our soils. Our soils are extremely important in storing carbon and keeping it out of the air. So the previous speaker just referred to soil carbon sequestration not being accounted for in most schemes, and this is really something we have to overcome because it is such an important tool for humanity to store carbon where it needs to be, in the ground, in our healthy soils. So now the bovine comes along and eats some of that plant material, some of that cellulose or starch, converts some of that into methane, which stays in the air for 10 years and is converted back into CO2. So you have a one-way street on the one side and you have a cycle on the other side. Nobody should compare a cow to a car. That's my take-home message on this one, because they are totally different. We're adding new additional carbon on the one side and we are recycling carbon on the other side. I will now explain to you the difference between CO2, a long-lived climate pollutant, versus methane. So let's imagine you were to drive from home to work on Monday. By burning gas, you will put new and additional CO2 into the atmosphere. On Tuesday, you drive the same distance and you add new additional CO2 to the atmosphere on Tuesday. But that's now on top of what you put out the previous day. On Wednesday, you drive again, you put new additional CO2 into the atmosphere. And every time you do that, you add to the existing stock of CO2 in the atmosphere. Hence the name stock gas. Okay? Remember this, CO2 and nitrous oxide are stock gases. Every time something produces these gases, they stay in the atmosphere. Every time you've ever driven a car, all of that CO2 is still in the atmosphere. And on top of what your parents put out and your grandparents and so on. That stuff is in the air for 1,000 years. Okay? And GWP 100 currently acts as if methane were also a stock gas, as if it were also to accumulate. Every time your cows on your dairy belch, it treats them as if that is new and additional carbon on top of what your cows put out a year ago or 10 years ago. But that we now know is not true. It's not correct, because methane is not just produced, it's also destroyed. And that makes methane a so-called flow gas. The amount of methane produced by a constant herd of cattle and the amount of methane destroyed are in balance. It does not accumulate like CO2 does. I give you an analogy. I'm a big fan of analogies. Imagine two bathtubs. The one is the analogy for CO2, and then the second one will be the analogy for methane. The first analogy for CO2 is a bathtub that has a faucet but no drain. Anytime you open that faucet, water goes into that bathtub and the levels rise. That's what happens with CO2. Every time we burn fossil fuels, we add to the existing stock of CO2, and as a result, temperatures rise. Now comes the second analogy, the methane bathtub analogy. Here you have a faucet, but you also have a drain. And if you turn that faucet on the normal rate, then the same amount of water that goes into the bathtub is going out through the drain, meaning no change in water levels. And that's what happens when we have constant cattle herds, let's say, constant methane sources. If we crank that faucet on all the way, then we might add more water than we let go through the drain, and then levels rise. And we do see that in some parts of the third world where livestock herds are increasing. We don't want to see that, and we actually have to work hard to circumvent that by helping them become more efficient. But what happens when you turn down that faucet is that you now have reduced the inflow, but the outflow is still the same, and that means now levels go down. And that's a beautiful thing. That's only possible with a flow gas, not with a stock gas. So it's really important to understand the behavior of a gas and how it affects warming. And GWP 100 does not depict that impact on warming. The first folks who came out with that were Miles Allen from the University of Oxford, and then also Dave Frame from New Zealand and others who said, hey, what we're doing with methane is wrong. We are depicting it as if it were a stock gas, as if it were to build up, even though there is an atmospheric removal process, and that's not accounted for using GWP 100. We are making a mistake. And that comes at a very high price for our agricultural sector. So they wrote a bunch of white papers and blogs and so on. You see some of them depicted on this slide, but also, of course, a lot of peer-reviewed published data in high-impact journals. And my own team has written several. They are currently under review and will soon be published. So what they said was, we need a new unit. GWP 100 does not do a fair job on methane. So they proposed a new unit called GWP star. And I will explain that on the next two slides. These next two slides will be a little technical, but they are very important to understand why the unit to quantify methane is so important and why what we currently use is so inappropriate. This slide here shows three scenarios. The first one is an increasing scenario where we increase methane by 35% over 30 years. This could be because in a certain region we increase cattle herds and as a result increase warming. The second theoretical scenario is one where we hold our methane pretty stable, maybe slightly reduced by 10% over 30 years. And the third one is a more aggressive scenario where we actually decrease methane by 35% over 30 years. Okay, how would these three scenarios, the increasing, stable, and the decreasing scenario for methane, be depicted using this old unit GWP 100? If we were to do that, then the GWP 100 calculation would depict all three scenarios, the increasing, stable, and decreasing scenario, as adding significant additional amounts of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases. And that's wrong. While the top here is agreeable, I'm agreeable to it, at the middle and the bottom one here, we see where a significant mistake is made because it does not account for the atmospheric removal of this very important gas. It acts as if methane were a stock gas and not a flow gas. So hence the criticism of my colleagues from Oxford and other places and their pledge to use a new unit called GWP star. GWP star predicts the same impact of increasing amounts of methane over a period of 30 years as GWP 100 does. What you see in blue here is a significant amount of additional warming that's caused when we increase methane. Again, we don't want to do that. But look what happens if we hold our methane emissions stable or slightly reduce them even. Then you don't see any blue north of the x-axis. That means there is no additional warming from either a constant herd or from any herd that has a slight reduction over time. You see even a little bit blue, and that means negative warming south of the x-axis. And the sign in front of the number has changed from positive over here to negative on the right. And that means there's now a little bit of negative warming occurring because we decreased methane by 10% over 30 years. But look what happens when you decrease methane strongly by, let's say, 35%. Then we actually pull carbon from the atmosphere and it induces a strong negative warming, meaning a cooling impact. If we reduce methane, we have a short-term lever for reducing our climate impacts. And our dairy sector can do that, not just here where I live, but also throughout the rest of the world. We have to find ways of reducing methane, and when we do so, we have an instantaneous impact on climate, as the next slide will show. Two scenarios here. One is, let's say, a power plant that over, let's say, 20, 30 years increases the amount of power produced, and as a result, the CO2 levels go up from that power plant. What will the warming caused by this increasing amount of CO2, what will the warming look like? It will increase, and you see this at the bottom here, it will increase exponentially. Why exponentially? Because CO2 is a stock gas, and as you remember the pyramid depiction I showed earlier, it accumulates in the atmosphere. If we increase methane linearly, let's say by growing a feedlot population from 10,000 cattle to 15,000 cattle, then we see an equal linear increase in the warming caused by that methane. Okay, so we do not want to see an increase in methane because that would cause an increase in warming. Now let's take a look at constant emissions. Let's say our power plant is running on constant load over 30 years. How does that affect warming? Well, the warming goes up from the constant CO2 source. Why? Because it's cumulative. It's accumulating. A constant number of cattle producing a constant amount of methane leads to a constant amount of warming. No increased warming from constant cattle herds. Remember that. Remember what the Paris Climate Accord is all about? It's not about net zero carbon or reduce our carbon by so and so much. It is about not increasing warming. Okay, we try to cap the warming by 1.5 to 2 degrees. That's what the Paris Climate Accord is about. A constant cattle herd does not increase warming. It leads to no change in warming. But now let's take a look what happens when we reduce emissions. And that's what all my work is all about, reducing emissions. So reducing emissions of CO2 versus reducing emissions of methane. How does that look like? Let's say our power plant were in a process of being turned down over time, and then we would stop it. So if you reduce that CO2 by turning that power plant down, then what happens to the warming? Look at that. That warming still goes up, even though we are decreasing CO2. It still goes up all the way to the point up until we stop that power plant and we kill that power plant. Then the related CO2 warming will plateau. That's what it takes. And that's why the world is talking about net zero. Because for fossil fuel, you need to go to net zero to stop further warming. But that's not the case for methane. For methane, any reduction of methane will lead to a negative warming scenario, meaning a cooling scenario. So it's the reverse of what you saw on the left side, where increases of methane lead to linear increases of warming from that methane. If you decrease methane, you see a linear decrease of the warming related with that methane. So you will now probably ask me, is it possible for us to achieve at a situation where we, by reducing methane, can actually contribute to negative warming, meaning having a net cooling effect, such as planting trees would provide us with. Because when we plant trees, what do the trees do? They suck carbon out of the atmosphere. That's what trees do. And so reducing methane would have a similar effect, but an instantaneous one. So in California, we have a new law. It's called SB 1383, and it mandates a 40% reduction, a 40% reduction of methane to be achieved by the year 2030. So only 10 years from now. When our farmers first heard that, they went wild, and they thought, never can we achieve that. Little did they know that our state, the state of California, had something planned that actually worked well, which was to incentivize, financially incentivize, the use of techniques and technologies to reduce methane. The state put in $500 million that was matched by the dairy industry to put in anaerobic digesters and other technologies. And the state established a cap and trade system. And one way of that dairies benefited from it was that they could convert biogas from digesters into fuel. And here you can see that. This is a typical California dairy. You see here what used to be an open lagoon now being covered. And as a result, it's called a covered lagoon. So instead of off-gassing just into the atmosphere like this lagoon did before, now the biogas is trapped underneath this tarp and not burned or flared off or so, not burned to be made into electricity, but this biogas is then used to make fuel from it, so-called renewable natural gas, RNG. And that RNG is then sold to the vehicle fleets, let's say semi-trucks, that now no longer burn diesel, but RNG. This conversion of biogas to fuel, biogas to RNG, is considered the most carbon negative fuel type there is. The most carbon negative fuel type there is. And that means that's a good thing. Sounds negative, sounds bad, but it's a good thing in this case. Carbon negative means it is much lower in its carbon intensity than other fuel types. And as a result, the state of California pays for people who do what I just said, convert biogas from digesters into fuel by granting them low carbon fuel standard credits. Low carbon fuel standard credits. So 5 years ago, we might have had maybe 10 or so functioning digesters in California. Very soon we will have 150, and within the next 5 to 10 years, I'd be shocked if not at least half of our dairies were to have technology such as this. Where did it take us? Well, we have already reduced our methane by 2.2 million metric tons, which is a reduction of 25%. Our dairy industry has reduced its methane by 25%. I told you the goal is 40%, so we are over halfway there. We're over halfway there. In other words, and I go back to this slide, we have achieved, or we are on path to achieving, this bottom scenario of reducing methane sharply and as a result affecting negative warming, which means cooling, from the methane portion of the dairy. Okay, the dairy still produces nitrous oxide and CO2, and they have a warming potential that's significant. But by dropping the methane, that drop in methane will counteract the other greenhouse gases, leading us on a path to climate neutrality. Notice I'm not saying carbon neutrality, I'm saying climate neutrality, because in my opinion, that's what it's all about. It is not about carbon, it is about getting our sector to not contribute to further warming, making us become climate neutral. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is possible within the near future. We did calculations for the United States, and we found that if we were able to reduce methane by, reduce greenhouse gases from the dairy sector by 0.4% annually, if we were able to reduce greenhouse gases by 0.4% annually, that by 2038, our entire dairy industry in this country were climate neutral. We're at a point where it doesn't affect the climate of our planet. And that is what I call the path to climate neutrality. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not some kind of greenwashing or creative accounting. This is absolutely quantifiable and verifiable. Because, for example, in the case of covered lagoons, all that biogas is metered. The conversion to renewable natural gas is metered. That fuel is sold off, and it's verified by the state. These numbers were verified by the state of California's Secretary of Agriculture, and I'm very proud to be part of that. But this is not the only technology, okay? This is just on the manure side. Very soon, as the previous speaker said, we will have other technologies like feed additives. We've done research comparing dozens of feed additives. Most of them didn't work, but 5 of them did, and these 5 had reductions of anywhere between 10 to 50% of methane as a result. So we are making aggressive steps to lead our industry into a situation where it will not affect the climate in the near future. So with that, I want to just announce that we have a blog as part of my CLIA Center here at UC Davis, and I'm very active on Twitter, and you find my center, the CLIA Center, on the web under this address. So with that, I'm looking forward to discussions later on. I thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mitloehner. A very interesting presentation, very interesting information, and it's remarkable to see those big changes. I think many people would not imagine that such big changes have been possible in a relatively short period of time. I'm sure a lot of people will be looking from around the world at how those changes were made in California and how they could address those aspects. So as we said, we're going to leave the questions to the panel discussion. So at this point, I would like to turn the session over to my co-chair, Dr. François Eudes from he's the Research Development Technology Director, Alberta, for the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. His PhD is in plant science, and he's done considerable work on technologies in tissue cultures and their applications in cereals. In his role, he's director of 2 major research centers in Alberta, which include research on agro-ecosystem resilience and discovery research in plant and animal microbiomes, livestock and meat production, as well as crop scientists. So please, Dr. Eudes, I pass the chair to you.
Thanks very much, Geoffrey, for the introduction. I really enjoyed the first 2 talks. That was really great. I'm particularly interested in the contribution of livestock in the agricultural climate solutions, and so there was a lot of good information here. I'm going to introduce a 3rd speaker. So our 3rd speaker is the Professor Ratan Lal. He's a distinguished university professor in soil science and director of the Carbon Management and Sequestration Center at the Ohio State University. He is a prolific author. He has also mentored and trained many scientists, and he has been recognized for the excellent leadership in soil science and agriculture over the years. I want to mention that he was included in the Thomson Reuters list of world's most famous influential scientist minds, 2014-16. And again, it was recognized, just to mention a few awards he has received. He is a laureate of the GCHERA World Agricultural Prize in 2018, as well as, just to mention another one, the latest one, the World Food Prize in 2020. We have a recording of his presentation, which is going to be launched. I want to mention that he will be joining us for the panel discussion later today. So I think Stefan will be launching the presentation.
I would like to thank the International Life Sciences Institute, the chairman, Dr. Mike Doyle. I got the invitation from Dr. Jeff Smith and Stephanie Widry and all others who made this meeting possible. The topic that I'm going to discuss is the potential of regenerative agriculture for carbon management and sustainability. So to begin with, I'd like to define regenerative agriculture and sustainability. Regenerative agriculture is inspired by eco-innovation. It's powered by non-carbon energy, driven by a circular economy and green infrastructure, and supported by the recarbonization of the terrestrial biosphere, soil and vegetation as the bedrock of sustainable development. Therefore, soil organic matter, essential to soil health, is the elixir of life. With that perspective, system-based regenerative agriculture reconcile the need for producing adequate and nutritious food with the necessity of restoring the environment and making farming a solution to environmental issues. I emphasize the word solution rather than a problem. In this context, regenerative agriculture encompasses a wide range of farming and grazing practices aimed at restoration and sustainable management of soil health through sequestration of soil organic carbon. There is no one-size-fits-all practices for diverse soils and biomass, and regenerative agriculture compasses conservation agriculture as one example, and conservation agriculture itself includes, for example, no-till farming, residue mulching, cover cropping, integrated nutrient and pest management, complex rotation, and integration of crops with trees and livestock. These components have to be fine-tuned under site-specific conditions. Remember, there are 300,000 known soil series, many ecoregions, many biophysical and socioeconomic conditions. Even if you have only 5 components to combine for site-specific condition, to say that there is a one practice would be rather naive, but the principles are acceptable. Regenerative agriculture leads to carbon sequestration because of its maintaining continuous soil cover, soil never to be left bare, no soil disturbance, no plowing, nutrient management through integrated soil fertility management options, and complex rotations so that we can restore soil organic carbon, improve soil fertility, and soil quality and functionality. And that is what regenerative agriculture is all about. And the goal is to producing more from less chemicals, less water, less energy. Now, taking the second definition, sustainability, a state in which demands placed on the environment can be met without reducing its capacity to allow all people to live well now and in the future. 4 pillars of sustainability: environmental, economic, social, institutional, and these are all important. Therefore, sustainability is the integration or balancing of environmental, social, institutional, and economic issues. And I personally focus on environmental. Soil is a component of the environment. Therefore, sustainable development implies making people better off in an ethically sound way. And that is what stewardship is all about. Soil, as a living entity, is the basis of all life. In fact, Charles Kellogg of USDA said there can be no life without soil and no soil without life. They have evolved together. And I like to go a step further. The rhizosphere, the soil root interface at nanoscale, is the only place in the universe where the death is resurrected into life when the microbe transforms the dead organisms into minerals that are absorbed by plant roots and the life begins again. A healthy soil is rich in organic matter content. It has 25% of all terrestrial biodiversity in the surface layer of the soil. Therefore, rich organic matter content soil is a healthy soil. And what's a healthy soil? Soil's capacity as a dynamic and a biologically active entity within natural managed landscape to do what? To sustain multiple ecosystem services such as net primary productivity, food and nutritional security. The word nutritional is very important. Biodiversity, water purification and renewability, carbon sequestration, air quality, and atmospheric chemistry. Elemental cycling. For what? For human and nature. Do not forget nature. We, human, are part of nature. If nature doesn't benefit, we do not benefit either. Look around you and you will understand what I mean. There is a strong nexus between human health and soil health. In fact, human health is a fingerprint of soil health. Therefore, human health can be improved, should be improved by restoration of soil health of degraded, polluted, and contaminated soil. 1/3 of all soils globally are degraded, polluted, contaminated, eroded. It must be taken care of. And the substitute to bring new land rather than taking care of those which we have degraded is not a good one. Therefore, restoration of soil organic matter content to above the threshold range can improve soil health and nutritional quality of the food produced. I strongly believe that the health of soil, plants, animals, human, environment, and the planetary processes is interconnected. Therefore, rather than focusing just on 1 or 2 issues, it's very important also to address the sustainable management of natural resources in the context of the environment quality. Soil organic matter content is the elixir of life. And this has several components. Living organism constitute about 5%, fresh residue about 10%, decomposing organic matter about 30 to 50%, already decomposed organic matter about 33 to 50%. It's a very dynamic entity in soil. And the management of this is what we call on the basis of law of return. And the law of return says whatever you're taken out of soil in harvesting the produce, grains, milk, animal products, must be replaced. If it is not replaced, we got a problem. And that is the case with extractive farming. We must respond wisely to what is changed, and we must be able to predict what will happen from anthropogenic and natural perturbations. And we must restore degraded soil by carbon sequestration. The idea is to produce more from less. And what do we mean by more from less? How do we achieve it? Organic matter content is one of the key factors. The critical range of organic matter content is about 3.5 to 4%, maybe 2.5 to 4%. 2.5 maybe in the tropical soils, 4% maybe the temperate region soil. Organic carbon content is about 50% of the organic matter content. Therefore, the optimum level is somewhere between 2.5 to 4. Most soils of the degraded ecosystems, especially of the tropics and subtropics, the soil organic matter content is less than 0.5%. I fully support the idea that the soils of Africa and Asia must have more fertilizer application. The 17 kilogram per hectare in sub-Saharan Africa is not adequate. But putting fertilizer on degraded soil is a double jeopardy. That's the part we must understand. We must make sure that the soils, anywhere we put fertilizer, are responsive to receiving the chemical fertilizers. That is a part of creating a positive soil carbon budget, which means what we put into the soil through, for example, biochar, compost, cover crops, root biomass, crop residue must always exceed what is being lost from the soil by erosion. Very serious problem, leaching, decomposition, erosion and decomposition more. Unfortunately, in extractive farming practices adopted by most resource poor small landholders, most of the developing countries, we have the extractive system leading to more losses than gains. Therefore, soils are continuously being degraded. And if due to degraded soil, we try to improve, restore organic matter content, for example, those which have a 0.5%, and we add organic matter content in the root zone by 1 metric ton per hectare, for everything else remaining the same. The nitrogen fertilizer, the other inputs, tillage system, residue management, varieties, the yield of different crops can be increased somewhere between 100 to 300 kilogram per hectare for maize, 20 to 50 for soybean, 20 to 70 for wheat, rice, sorghum, millet, all crops, including the root crops. So adding carbon content in the soil by 10 tons, and that 10 tons may take more than 10 years, perhaps more like a 15 to 20 years, you could multiply the crop yield in developing countries tremendously, and at the same time improve the quality of the food, nutritional quality of the food, and to save resources like fertilizer, irrigation, pesticide, because by this you create disease suppressive soil. So the slogan in developing countries should be CNPK. Yes, NPK are needed, absolutely. But if C goes before them, then the need for NPK progressively decreases over time. The use efficiencies of nitrogen especially, which right now is maybe 25, 30% under ideal condition, best scenarios, can go up, and the rate of application of chemical can go down. By having high soil biodiversity, because carbon is the food of the microorganism and macro and mesoorganism, soils become disease suppressive, and therefore they do not also need as much pesticides. And this is the concept of CNPK through cover crop, residue mulching, and integrated system of soil fertility management. Therefore, there is a time for a paradigm shift to transformation of US and UN and worlds and any country you like food production system. The green revolution, seed-centric and based on fossil fuel inputs of fertilizer, pesticide, tillage, irrigation, is definitely feeding 90% of the world population of 7.7, 7.8 billion people. Without green revolution, about 50% of the world population would probably have starved. However, dependence on fossil fuel-based inputs and their environmental ramification cannot be ignored, must be addressed. Fossil fuel emission from 1750 to 2019 are about 445 gigaton. Combine those with soil and vegetation, total 575 gigaton since 10,000 BCE when agriculture began, is the principal cause of the anthropogenic climate change, air pollution, water contamination, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and other environmental problems. We cannot ignore them. They have to be addressed. And yet 1 in 11 people is prone to hunger, and 2 to 3 in 7 are hidden hunger, malnutrition. And the pandemic has aggravated that problem by another perhaps 130 plus million people who are affected by disruption in food supply chain. Therefore, the humanity is at a crossroads and faced with the challenge of reconciling the need for sustaining food production with the necessity of restoring degraded ecosystem and improving the environment through adoption of regenerative agriculture, which I have defined what it is. Therefore, the 21st century green revolution now, the second green revolution, should be soil-based, soil resilience, so that the need for pesticides, herbicides, fertilizer can be decreased over time. Remember, I'm not about eliminated altogether. Some may be needed because we certainly have soil which do not have enough nutrients, but manage them judicially because of the soil health management, through the soil health management. It must be ecosystem-based, eco-efficiency of the inputs improved, and it has to be science-driven, which is the very important part. And of course, soil and agriculture and forestry and landscape have to become a carbon sink. We have lost quite a lot of carbon over the last 10,000 years since the agriculture began. We can restore the carbon back into the terrestrial biosphere. Here is an example of an improved system. You got a plant, which obviously can be used with a deep root system, has a larger biomass compared to dwarf varieties, which we are talking about in the 60s, and with less root biomass. We want more root biomass, more above ground biomass, and yet we should be able to communicate with the plant through molecular based signal emitted when the plant is under stress. And that way we can save quite a lot of problem which may happen when we do not understand that the plant was going through some issues that need to be addressed. And this should be combined with no-till, with mulch farming, with cover cropping, and of course, integration of crops with trees and livestock, so that the recycling of nutrients can happen. And through addition of biomass to the critical level that I was talking about, 3.5 to 4%, soil can become disease suppressive. They have very high activity of the microorganism. And if some additional nutrients are needed, this is a very important part. I'm not saying they are not needed. If they are needed, and they will be, especially during the transition period, they must be applied in such a way directly to the plant roots according to the 4 R's: right time, right dose, right method of application, right formulation, so that most of these are absorbed by plants and do not leak out into the environment. That's a problem which I'm concerned about: indiscriminate use of inputs and they leak out into the environment. So the technical potential of carbon sequestration this way, technical maximum possible, is about 2.5 petagram gigaton of carbon on a global scale per year. In the terrestrial biosphere, soils have a potential between 2020 and 2100, sequestering 178 petagram gigaton. Vegetation 155. That's 333 total, which is equivalent to about 157 parts per million of CO2. This is not enough to mitigate global warming unless the fossil fuel emissions are stopped. Once they are stopped by finding non-carbon fuel sources, and we can then implement also same time restoring the carbon stock in the trees and soils, both organic and inorganic carbon sequestration, yes, the fate of climate change is still within our hand and manageable. But fossil fuel substitution, non-carbon, must be found. Translating science into action requires adopting innovations. It can require technologies, organization, processes, management, and of course the governance. All these are important part of the environmental sustainability. And reduced economic returns, chronic poverty, hunger, malnourishment, desperateness certainly are as threat to global peace and stability as any weapons of mass destruction. Yet we ignore this very simple concept. Therefore, what we are looking for is a pyramid. The base of this pyramid is a healthy soil and natural resources and carbon stock in the trees and biomass. This pyramid has 4 sides. Food security we can achieve with this technique. Climate change adaptation mitigation can be addressed with this strategy. Land and soil restoration, land degradation neutrality can be achieved by this technology. And of course, the biodiversity can be enhanced by this technology. However, this pyramid cannot be stable unless the 4 corners where it meet has a strong cementing glue. And the glue is the political stability and peace and the policy that translates science into action. And that's what at the UN Food Summit we are now talking about. And one of the policy intervention is payment to farmers for ecosystem services at a fair and right price. Undervaluing such a precious resource, such as for $2 or $10 per ton of CO2, is a mistake. Right price is about $30 to $35 per ton of CO2. If the carbon dioxide injection from the industrial output into the ground 1 mile below takes $50 per ton of CO2, why are we trying to undermine the payment to the farmers, ranchers, and foresters? I think this equity must be carefully understood. If farmers sequester half a ton per hectare of carbon, that is $65 per hectare, $26 per acre. If farmers sequester 1/3, that's $43 per hectare, $17.50 per acre. Another policy intervention I suggest is in terms of agricultural sustainability and looking at the rights of soil would be EPA already has a Clean Air Act, 1967. It has a Clean Water Act, 1972. How is it possible to have clean air and clean water when you do not have a healthy soil? Therefore, this is just the right time to have a healthy soil act through proper policy intervention and governance, probably in the coming Farm Bill of 2023. Lastly, I know this section is going to also discuss Edward Deming's famous saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But I think there is another side of the story that there are several things that cannot be measured. And I can think about many from the agricultural point of view, but they must be managed. If they are not managed properly, we are in deep trouble. And how to manage what you can't measure is a very key question that I hope you will discuss. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Professor Lal, for this thoughtful presentation.
And Dr.
I want to
Dutt,
mention.
I would like just to mention that Dr. Lal has joined us, so he's also hearing you. Just to mention that.
Excellent. Pleased to have you with us, Professor Lal. I know you will be taking questions later on at our later session. I would like to, so we'll keep the question for that discussion, panel discussion, which will happen later. I would like to invite our last speaker for the day. Dr. Porter is an internationally known agroecological scientist with an expertise in the ecosystem services in agroecosystems, including agroecology, simulation modeling, and food system ecology, including that of cities. He led the writing of the critically important chapter for the IPCC fifth assessment in Working Group 2 on food production systems and food security, including fishery and livestock, which formed an important scientific piece of the COP21 agreement in Paris in 2015. He has recently become a member of the Interdisciplinary International Working Group on Post-Growth Economics and founder member of the Advanced Research Institute at the University of Montpellier and science consultant at one of the Planet Fellowship program. He was also recognized with international prizes for his research. And I'm happy to have you on this session today to talk about the science for agriculture towards sustainability and potential CO2 management. Dr. Porter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I don't know how to get my PowerPoint
I
up.
see it on the corner, top corner. Yeah.
Okay.
Just open it.
All right.
Click on it.
I've got it here.
Yeah, and just play it as you usually present.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Very good.
Maybe put it full screen. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll make it full screen. Just let me get rid of this thing on the side. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sitting in Denmark, up in the north of Europe, and it's dark outside. It's because it's 10 at night. And I'd just like to thank the invitation to present some ideas to you today. I was asked to say what my conflict of interests were. Well, I'm a retired scientist, so my only real conflict of interest is if I get my pension at the end of the month. This is the only thing I think causes conflict. Thank you for the introduction. I did worked with the IPCC for a long time, and I've also spent quite a lot of time working in France as well, where I spend quite a lot of my time these days. The important thing, oops, we don't want to do that. Yeah, one of the things Ratan Lal did not mention this, but he certainly drew attention to it. But if we look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we have globally, it is very interesting, and I put little red stars on the ones which had connections to agriculture and connections to food systems and connections to the land. And you can see there must be about 6 or 7 of these Sustainable Development Goals, which are directly related to how human beings work on the land. And one of the things I think is one of the things where we get somewhere confused, I think, is this, and Professor Lal referred to this, and I would like to discuss this with him really, but we can improve the efficiency of the use of fossil fuels and sources and produce more efficiently, but does this not mean that we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So there is this trade-off really, or this interrelation between what we can do relatively and what we can do in terms of absolutes. And why is this? Well, one of the reasons why this is true is because of something called the Jevons paradox, which William Jevons was an economist in the 19th century, and he showed basically that if you improve the efficiency of things, what this did was not to decrease consumption, it actually increased consumption, because people find it cheaper to buy things, so they're just going to buy more and more. And this leads to the conclusion that I'm going to talk about, is that emissions are basically a combination both of production but also consumption. And we basically really have to think about both of these aspects, the production and also the consumption. And hopefully I can say a few words about this. I just wanted to say that with Frank, I mean, I completely 110% agree with him saying that being carbon neutral is not being the same as climate neutral. There is a lag between what happens to the global carbon budget and what happens to the global climate budget, or what happens to the global climate. And I'm very glad that he made that point. It's a very important point. There are four hypotheses that I have presented in different fora, and one of the things I think is very interesting is John Maynard Keynes. He was a very influential economist, of course, in the 20th century, and I'm actually writing a paper about him at the moment. But I really liked his statement. It says, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?" I think that's a very good question to ask. And I think we have seen that getting more from less, i.e. increasing efficiency, does not always lead to increased robustness, and that system redundancy is a good thing. I think we've seen that very clearly in the pandemic that we're in the middle of at the moment, or hopefully coming out of at the moment. That those societies which had put a great emphasis on efficiency, actually, when it came to this pandemic, were not very well equipped to deal with. So I would say that system redundancy, having some kind of slack in the system redundancy is a good thing. There's also a discussion in ecology. I can remember when I was an ecology student that what is the position of complexity? Does complexity lead to stability? And I think that the consensus now is that increased complexity can and cannot lead to increased robustness and resilience. It can do, but it also can have a system where things get over-connected. That does not lead to increased robustness and resilience. I'm convinced now that we understand that decreased robustness, and I mean robustness is different from resilience. Robustness is like a preventative thing. How do you prevent things from happening? Resilience is how can we recover from a shock? And I think we have to think about robustness much more than we think about resilience. Decreased robustness leads to decreased efficiency. I'm convinced about that. And increased robustness leads to increased efficiency and resilience. And I think it has been clear with COVID-19 that those societies which had some inbuilt robustness actually have come out of this better than other societies which didn't have that. And what I want to do now is to talk about greenhouse gas emissions in a slightly different way than we heard from Frank. And what I'm trying to do here is trying to connect a couple of things. This is a diagram which shows the relative and total greenhouse gas emissions and how it's spread between the efficiency of production and the consumption. So, and this was developed by a Japanese scientist called Kaya. It's called the Kaya identity. And what it's doing is actually breaking down greenhouse gas emissions into these different elements. So if you reduce the greenhouse gas emissions per unit energy, and that basically has been happening, for example, if you change from coal to methane as a source of energy, if you decrease the energy needed per unit of gross domestic product, and again, in the industrialized society since the Second World War, that's generally been the case. But what has actually happened, of course, is that GDP, gross domestic product per unit population, has increased enormously, like about twice as much as the energy per GDP has decreased. And then you've got population. So you can see if you multiply all those little elements out, then you basically come up with the greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a way of what I call deconstructing the emissions into these different factors. But this only applies, this what we're seeing here only applies to the fossil fuel industry. This only applies to emissions from fossil fuels. Excuse me, I'll just have a drink of water. It doesn't actually apply to the land use emissions. And because it does not apply to the land use emissions, I was one day on my bike cycling back from the university, and I've been teaching the carrier identity to students during the day. And then I thought, well, you could write an equivalent identity analysis for the agricultural emissions. And so I came up with this, which is basically that the yield per unit area times the energy needed to produce a particular amount of yield times the greenhouse gases that you use, or the amount of greenhouse gases you use to produce a product per unit energy times the area. You can also deconstruct the emissions from land use, from the land use emissions into this identity as well. And you can see area in this case takes the place of population. This is the integration, if you like, in this what's called the Kaya-Porter identity. And we had a couple of students. I did this work with Eskil Bennison in Copenhagen, and Pete Smith. I'm sure you've heard of Pete Smith at Aberdeen. He and I were the PhD supervisors of Eskil Bennison. And we were able to create these identities for different components in the production of greenhouse gases from crops. We also did it for livestock as well. And I don't actually have time to show you this, but you can see the elements that we included in this integrated Kaya-Porter identity for the greenhouse gas from crops. And it allowed us to produce these kind of figures. We published a couple of papers in Global Change Biology. And what was interesting, I find here, is that if we look at the relative values, if we take 1970 as a starting point, and that has a relative value of 1, then you can see that, for instance, greenhouse gas energy per produced unit has actually increased quite substantially. Total emissions of greenhouse gases from crops have also increased, but there have been some elements in this identity which have actually fallen since 1970. So greenhouse gases per land use change per produced unit. And I think it's also very important to think about the fact that many times we talk about greenhouse gases per unit area, but we really need to think about greenhouse gases per unit product. And I think Jeremy, at the beginning of the talk, when he was talking about his work in New Zealand with Fonterra, that was very interesting, I think, because of the emphasis there was on the emissions per unit product. And we have emissions per unit area, but we also have emissions per unit product. And this idea of trying to break these things down into different components can also be used in terms of the resource use efficiency. So what is the efficiency with which resources, particularly radiation, water, and nitrogen, fertilizer, are used? And you can write these kind of equations, which is trying to break down the yield per unit evapotranspiration into these other elements here. And you can draw some pretty pictures, which you can see at the bottom, where you can look at the relations between these different resource efficiencies and the trade-offs in a kind of quadrant system. And I take no credit at all for the originality of this, because this is going back to Kees de Wit's PhD in the 1950s in Wageningen. He was the first person to have these ideas about how you could deconstruct these efficiencies, these resource use efficiencies. And there have been some experimental work. This is done by Edmar Teixeira at Lincoln University in New Zealand, and Hamish Brown and other people down at Lincoln University. And one of the things I think is important here is, and what Edmar and Hamish and others were looking at was how resource use efficiencies interact with each other. Because I'm sure we would agree that resource use efficiencies by themselves, they're interesting, but what's more interesting is how do resource use efficiencies interact with each other. So here we have the relationship in the top graph here, in the A graph here, which is the water use efficiency against the nitrogen use efficiency. And you can see that in a dryland situation, this water use efficiency per unit dry matter or nitrogen use efficiency decreases. And it does here with the in the dryland and also the irrigated. But when you look at the relationship between radiation use efficiency, this is in the B and C graph here, against nitrogen use efficiency, you see that the order of these efficiencies has been reversed. So here we have dryland above irrigated, and here we have irrigated above dryland. So I really think it's important that we need to think about these resource use efficiencies in a more integrated kind of way and how they interact to each other. And finally, I mean, I have not really done very much work on this, but I was thinking, you know, how can we tie together these identities so that we have the Kaya identity here, we have the Kaya border identity here, and then we can also write identities for demand. So this is demand is animal protein divided by total protein per unit calorie, calorie per capita times population, and we can write other kinds of identities as well. And what we see here is that the same element may appear in more than one identity. And this gives us a possibility to look at the interactions between wealth, health, consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that we can create a framework where we can look at these interactions, which I think are very, very important, as many of the speakers have said. Now, I'd like to just move on to talking about food systems for a couple of slides. And about 10, 15, 20, 12 years ago, we did a study actually in the European Union of the food system of Europe. And the food system of Europe looks like this. This is before the expansion of the EU. But I mean, you have a number of producers at the bottom, and then you have suppliers and semi-manufacturers and manufacturers. And then you come down to this place in the middle here, which is the buying desks of supermarkets. And then it expands from there out to the customers and the number of people who are the customers in Europe. And this is the shape of the supply chain funnel in Europe. And you can see that, of course, the power in this hourglass, it's like an hourglass, is in the center of this organization here. There may be less than maybe 1,200. It probably increased since this figure was done, but maybe there are less than 2,000 people in Europe who are basically deciding what most Europeans actually eat. And I don't want to go this in much detail, but one of the things that we were interested in when down in Montpellier, when we were working in Montpellier, was this distinction between linear food systems and circular food systems. And I think there's a lot of interest in how these two different types of food systems. This is actually from H.T. Odum's work, and there's a lot of interest in how linear and circular food systems are working. One of the things that we worked with on in the work that we did in Montpellier was what are the basic elements in circular food systems. And I think these came out as some of the 4 principles that plant biomass is the basic building block of food that should be used by humans. I mean, we talk about getting more from less, but I think the alternative is enough from less, reducing waste and increasing what we save. I mean, I think the idea that it's just more from less is a really idea which is a bit passé. The byproducts from food production, processing, consumption should be recycled back into the food system. I think we agree about that. And use animals for what they're good at. I mean, they are valuable sources of protein for many people, particularly young people and pregnant women, for example. But we need to think about how we use animals for what they're good at. And this is really some work that came from Martin Benitesen, who's a professor at Wageningen in Holland. I just want to say, because I know that But Geoff was telling me that there's an interest in the food systems of cities, particularly Singapore. And I just wanted to refer to a study that we did in global food security about 10 years ago now, when we looked at the food systems of three capital cities. This is Australia, which is Canberra, and the Australian capital region, and Denmark. This is the, if I can actually point to the place where I'm sitting just at the moment, it's just about there. And then Tokyo. We had three cities, Canberra, Copenhagen, and Tokyo. And what was interesting about this was how they scaled in terms of the population density. So Canberra is about 0.1 person per hectare. Denmark is about 4.4 people per hectare, and Tokyo is about 12 persons per hectare. And I haven't got time to go into the information really, but we were able to look at the food systems of these different countries, of these different capital cities, and this, excuse me, was the situation in Tokyo. Huge imports. You can see the imports of wheat in 2005. And one of the things that we also were able to do was look at how these food systems in cities have changed over time. We were able to get hold of data. And so you can see really if the production of wheat gets short globally, then countries like Japan and Tokyo are going to be having some problems because they cannot go anywhere near supplying their own needs. The only place we really found that could go supplying its own needs was Canberra. And now, after saying all that, I really want to do what I call some really out-of-the-box stuff. And this is come about by the fact that when you're a retired professor, and you don't have to teach students, and you don't have to apply for research grants, you have a real chance to think about some other stuff. And this has been one of the things that I've really been enjoying doing in the last 2 or 3 months. Of course, with thinking about the COVID story, the COVID-19 story. And I want to just say here, this has a connection. What I'm going to talk about here has a connection to what I was talking about with the identities. I'm basically thinking about how to use identities in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic. We talk about the race between vaccination and the social distancing measures. There's a race between the two. How many people are going to get vaccinated? To what degree do the social measures, social distancing and lockdowns and these kind of things, how do these contribute to controlling the pandemic? And I invented a V number, which I call the V number, to quantify these two effects. And it's a simple thing. The V ratio, the V number, is the ratio between the percent of the population vaccinated divided by the percent of the population as active cases. And you can get all these data off World of Data and these other websites, enormously interesting websites. And of course, the V number will increase as you increase the percentage of the population vaccinated. And the V number will increase if you decrease the proportion of the population which is regarded as active cases. And the V number will really increase if you increase the vaccinated population and you decrease the active cases via social measures. And so then I thought, well, what's the link that you could get to the V number to this R infectivity statistic? This is actually, it's in some way based on the Euler-Lotka equation for population growth, but it isn't really. And of course, you know that the R number is, if it's a value of 1, then this means that people are not transmitting the virus to another person. So as long as this value is 1 or lower than 1, then there is no spread of the virus, and the virus will eventually die out. And this is a figure that I drew, that came up with in February this year. This is looking at the data from World of Data and all these things, where I plotted the V number on the y-axis here against the R value. And this is the line, this is the regression line. And you can see that there is a line here. I've drawn this red line here, which is where we have the R value of 1 or slightly lower than 1. And where does it cross this trend line? Well, it crosses it when the V number is about 10. So the ratio between percentage vaccinated over percentage active cases is about 10 to 1. And if you do that, then you're looking at a situation in which the R number is going to be lower than 1. And then I took it all the way from January the 11th to March the 27th. I took 9 dates, looked at all the data from 9 dates. And here we have the R value on this axis and the V value on here. And you can see that the V values have increased, and this is the best fit. This is the polynomial fit. And so here we're looking at a V number of about 20 to 30, which is going to give you an R number which is somewhere below 1. There's a lot of spread here. And this means that actually what this shows you is that different countries have used different measures. They've used different ways of trying to control the pandemic. And I've just had this published in it's actually a preprint journal at the moment, but it's going to be put into a regular medical journal that's when I get a bit of time. So here we're looking at a V number maybe of between 30 and 40. You would be pretty guaranteed to have an R number below 1. So my conclusions in this kind of out of the box thinking stuff is that food security is certainly more than production. We have to think about food security in terms of its aspects of consumption and what does it mean for waste. How do we make robust food security systems? I suggest we need synthetic and quantitative methods to connect wealth, consumption, diet, and population, and maybe these identities that I've tried to show to you this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, in fact, is something that we need to think about. I think that the mantra should be enough from less, save more, and waste less. That is the mantra that we try to live by. My wife is actually just sitting by the side of me here. So, what links are there between food systems and pandemics? I think that's a very important question for the future. I think there are some possible very interesting analyses that we could look at, the links between food systems and pandemics. Robustness is not the same as resilience. Slack and redundancy are good things. I mean, economists would say we have to run things as efficiently as possible. Well, I think they found out that that's not always the case. So even the economist, the bastion of liberal economics, says capitalism must up its game. Orthodox market economies have been useless in the current virus pandemic. A robust, flexible, resilient, and efficient food system in society needs insurance and assurance. We cannot solve current global problems with endless efficiency gains, carbon taxes, and carbon capture and storage. I mean, there's only so much carbon you can stick into the ground, and it does take an enormously long time to do that. I think Pete Smith reckoned it was about 3 gigatons per year. And it's very interesting, I think, the situation we're in now, that people are decidedly getting uncomfortable. So the question is, how comfortable do we actually feel at present in the current global situation? And I have the impression that when we started in IPCC back in the beginning of the 1990s, we were regarded as complete crackpots. And then we had this period where everybody was trying to just pull us apart. But I think that the situation is changing, and we need to change. We need to change very, 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 very fast. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and thank you for the chance to listen to all the presentations that we've had. I think it's been enormously interesting, and I've learned something in all of the presentations that we've had so far. So thank you for that. Done.
Thanks very much, Dr. Poulter, for this great presentation, as well as sharing your out-of-the-box thinking. I see we have the list of people for this panel discussion, but there is also a hand up. Geoffrey, how do you want to proceed?
Thank you, all the presenters. It's been a fantastic series of presentations. I think even people like Dr. Porter, who's been involved in this for a long time, has learned something new. So I think for those of us who are coming newer to it, it's been a real revelation. So let's open up the panel discussion, and let me sort of start that off. So we have the speakers and the co-chair to participate in the panel, and one additional panelist who's just joined us. So Dr. Beata Madari is going to be on the panel. She's an agronomist and soil scientist at Embrapa, which is the Brazilian Agriculture Research Corporation, and she's working in the National Research Center for Rice and Beans. She was a leader of Embrapa's network on greenhouse gas emissions for the grain crop production system, the Flux network, and she's on the executive committee now of the climate change portfolio of Embrapa. So she gives an important perspective from her own research and how regenerative agriculture has been studied and implemented in Brazil. So maybe we can start with some brief comments by Dr. Madari on her research and the perspective from Brazil, and perhaps some comments on the discussion so far. Dr. Madari.
Yes, thank you for the kind invitation, and sorry for that. And also for the opportunity to hear the previous presentations. I enjoyed them very much. So I'm speaking from Brazil, and well, first let me put in context Brazil in context of the presentation that we heard and in climate change. So in 2005, well, Brazil is the seventh largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. And in 2005, 72% of this emission came from land use change and deforestation, principally, and 13% of agriculture. In 2015, the proportions changed dramatically. 38% came from land use change and about 25% from agriculture. And agriculture was about at the same level of the energy sector, which is about 27%. It doesn't mean, however, that agriculture is emitting so much more greenhouse gases, but there was a huge reduction in the land use change sector. Within the agriculture sector, to compare a little bit with New Zealand, the enteric fermentation is responsible for about 60%, and it comes from beef cattle, from extensive systems. And from agricultural soils originates about 35% of the emissions. And looking at the source gases, methane is about 63–65%, and nitrous oxide 37%. But there was also a huge decrease from 2005 and 2009, between 2005 and 2015, about a 45% reduction of total emissions, total national emissions. And this is basically thanks to the implementation in 2009 of what we call a national climate change plan, which one important part of it is the forest law, which resulted in with a large reduction in deforestation. As for the agriculture sector, we also have the so-called what we call a low carbon emission agriculture program, which is based on and encourages the adoption of selected low carbon emission agriculture practices. such as the adaptation, such as the restoration of degraded pastures and improved pasture management, the zero-tillage system, integrated crop livestock forestry systems, and their different variations, feed inoculation for biological nitrogen fixation, and the forest plantations. Yeah. I think I will stop here, and maybe we can discuss more in the context of the previous presentations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, very much. So very interesting. So it's a big world out there, and I think from the recent study that I mentioned earlier by Dr. Kripa, she found that about 70% of the emissions were from developing countries, a little less than 30% from developed countries, which is not so different from the population ratio. So maybe unlike energy consumption, food is pretty operates within a narrower range. So if emissions are going to be reduced, there has to be a lot of that work actually done in developing countries, and so how that can be addressed and brought together is an important aspect. So we do want to hear from Professor Eudes also on the Canadian project, but maybe start in with some of the questions. So I would remind the audience, you can submit your questions in the panel box, and we will look at those and see how to address those. So let me just start with a couple of points that have been raised. So this whole discussion has been about essentially farming and livestock. And so a lot of people who may be listening have experience on the nutrition side and healthy diets and trying to work on that. And of course, the agriculture productivity and the crops that are grown has an impact on the nutrients that are consumed. So if plants are bred differently, they may have more or less nutrients, and there's a whole field looking at how to improve, for example, micronutrients in crops. But the conversation between the food processing industry and the agricultural industry is not always so well connected. So farmers, of course, get incentives to produce what they get paid for, and so they get paid for yields and how many tons per hectare and what's the price. So how can we improve the communication between farmers and, let's say, processors, dairy, milk products producers, food processors who rely on agriculture, and this link? So as Professor Lal pointed, this whole link between the agricultural food supply and livestock into processing and final consumption by consumers is a continuous connection, but not always easy to have the communications and incentives go that way. So maybe one of the panelists would like to start off on that particular topic.
Jeff, I'll make a brief comment. There are some concerned consumers who will pay premiums, will select on the basis of some of the credentials we've been talking about today around environmental performance. I think what you'll find is a lot more consumers with a societal concern, and it's genuine around these factors, than they follow the same purchase behaviors. So we don't necessarily get the mass signals at the moment. There are segments in the market that you can provide a very clear linkage between that value and production. And we're fortunate, being a cooperative in the case of Fonterra, that we're not disconnected at all from our suppliers. They are our owners. The key thing is having the information around the value and the clarity around those practices that are desired, and providing that linkage where there's value. Where there's cost but there's no value, it's very, very hard to drive. And as I say, you find that in general, there's a greater societal concern than there is purchase behavior. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important consideration, and for the packaged food industry, who is delivering products directly to consumers or via shops and stores, but has that closer connection, they might be able to help drive some of that activity. But that is something that probably needs a bit of attention on how to address that further. Let me go into this question. So again, I think for a lot of people hearing this, it may be the first time, or they have not been very aware of this whole issue of plant and soil microbiomes. So ILSI has done a lot of work on human microbiome, gut microbiome, and the importance of that in the gut, in the human metabolism. But this whole issue of huge reservoirs of microbes in the plant and soil will be new to some people. So we had a session last week also touching on this issue, or concentrating on this issue of the soil and plant microbiomes. And that's been a theme through these presentations. But I think it was also a conclusion that there's a tremendous variety in soil microbiomes around the world, not all of which are characterized. So we've seen some confident claims that significant amounts of carbon could be sequestered by supporting these soil microbiomes. But do we know enough about how the soil microbiomes are constituted in different parts of the world? Is it very different in very warm climates and more temperate climates? Maybe Professor Lal would have a comment on that. Professor Lal was able to join us. Or not? Okay, maybe he's having trouble with his connection. But this is an issue to know and also to drive practices. So as Dr. Hill mentioned, what you can't measure doesn't often get addressed, but which is of course more difficult for the individual farmer. So they can have an idea that they're moving in the right direction, but they may not really see those metrics or see the output change from their own operations and how to influence that. Maybe Dr. Eudes can comment about the Canadian situation, how you're trying to address those issues and some of your programs.
Sure. So the Canadian government has, do you want me to start with a few slides just to support
Sure, great.
that short?
Perfect.
I'll be brief, but just want to mention the Canadian government has made the climate change solutions and the transition to a much less intensive carbon economy a priority. And so for agriculture, the agricultural climate solution is one of the program that has been put in place. It's part of the Natural Climate Solution Fund, which is going to be managed by 3 different departments. So NRCan, Natural Resource Canada, will be managing a large envelope of the funding with the main goal to plant 2 billion trees. Environment and Climate Change Canada will have also a significant envelope with a mandate to restore and enhance wetlands, peatlands, grassland, and agricultural land to boost carbon sequestration. And Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada will have also a portion of these funds in order to increase on-farm adoption of beneficial management practices that would contribute to sequester carbon. And it's a co-development with producer groups. We can move to the next slide. The producer groups, the NGOs, indigenous communities, and Métis settlements as well. So program will be focusing on 3 things. The top priority is to contribute to offset carbon, so sequester carbon. contribute to the greenhouse gas emission reduction, in particular in relation to the synthetic nitrogen application in crop, but it could also include enteric methane emission reduction in cattle systems. And we also look with this program to maintain or enhance the environmental co-benefits such as the biodiversity, water quality, and soil quality. So the implementation will be done using a living lab model. It would be pan-Canadian with a minimum of 10 living lab, so minimum 1 per province. And we're going to use a data strategy in order to monitor and report at the end of a 10 years program how much gain has been done on carbon sequestration in particular, but also other greenhouse gas parameter. And quickly on the last slide, the approach really is to leverage an existing experience in the living lab. So this initiative just started. We got engagement session with stakeholders across a number of provinces. It's still ongoing. With this living lab approach, we're looking at user-centered innovation. Again, these different stakeholders who are going to participate form a coalition in different regions across Canada, are going to working together, identify the needs and the potential intervention that could be made in order to increase carbon sequestration and reduce greenhouse gas emission. Interestingly, the areas where the highest potential gain can be made have been identified by our science experts in soil and geomatics. So the different stakeholders across the country have access to these heat map, and they can see where there is a highest or potential to contribute to carbon sequestration in soil. And I'll stop here because I want to leave some time for this panel discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, very, very interesting work going on in Canada. Yes, Dr. Porter.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that this idea of sequestration, carbon sequestration, is a very slow process. I mean, I worked at Rothamsted in the UK for a while, and you know they had an experiment which had started in the 1800s, and they measured, you know, added a certain amount of carbon into the soil, and it had increased, but it was a very slow process. I think the other situation, I think, and the one thing that has to bear in mind is that once you get the carbon into the soil, you've got to keep it there. And this would then mean a lot of emphasis on perennial agriculture. I mean, New Zealand would be ideal because they have a lot of pasture down there. But I mean, if you're going to go into carbon sequestration, you've got to forget about ploughing. You've got to think. You've also got to increase your use of herbicides, for example, if you're going to do direct drilling, for example. So it's more than just saying we're going to put a lot of carbon into the soil. You know, we've got to keep it there, and keeping it there means you're not going to do any turning over of the soil. And I'd just like to also talk with Frank about the methane issue. I think that was an extremely interesting talk, and I learned a lot from it. What I think in the main point really was that you're thinking about how you can transfer essentially CO2 from the atmosphere into the soil. I mean, via going through the animals and then out of CO2 and then back into the soil again. And I think that's a really nice idea. But again, the soil is not an infinite sink for carbon. I mean, there is a limit to how you use this analogy of the basin. The capacity of the basin is not infinite. And I think that, you know, some work that Pete Smith has done, published in Nature Climate Change, was talking about 3 gigatons of sequestered carbon perhaps per year was a reasonable number. So I think that we have to think a little bit. You know, I tried to say let's think out of the box. I mean, I think it's good to think about these things, but there are consequences, I think, for agriculture, and maybe we should think in terms of moving away from arable systems and working towards perennial systems. I mean, there are plenty of really good perennial crops that provide lots of nutrition, and lots of legumes are perennials, chickpeas and all that kind of stuff. So it's more than just the technique of trying to get carbon into the soil. It's about keeping it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think perhaps we have Professor Lal joining us.
Yes.
And he may have some comment to that. And maybe I would just add one preface from my side, and then you could cover those issues. So we heard in your presentation a lot about carbon sequestration and that balance. And I'm thinking about this flux. So the IPCC has reported a kind of global greening, so increased vegetation around the world. And of course, it's hypothesized and shown in small scale studies that more CO2 allows more photosynthesis, of course, taking carbon dioxide from the soil and turning it into carbohydrates and cellulose, as we heard, with, of course, byproduct oxygen, which humans need. So how this balance of carbon sequestration and increased photosynthesis from increased atmospheric CO2, how all those fit together, and then responding to Professor Porter's point. Thank you, Professor Lal.
Oh, thank you very much. I had opportunity to listen to almost all the presentation. They were all excellent, superb, no question. I learned many things. Yes, I agree that soil carbon sequestration is slow. Yes, I indicated that you have to sequester 10 tons. It may take 20 years to do that. I agree that soil disturbance can release the carbon dioxide back. Yes, no plowing would be desirable. Yes, I agree that it's not good enough. It's very finite. We estimated the maximum potential is about 178 or 180 gigaton. That's it. And we also estimated that only 2.5 gigaton maximum can be put in soil. And that estimate was in co-authorship with Pete Smith. So all those things are correct. That's not debatable. That is correct. But yet it is essential to put carbon back in soil, because in addition to offsetting some of the anthropogenic emission, there are many other co-benefits which are essential in terms of food security, nutrition security, water quality, biodiversity, everything. So, and I also mentioned that 2.5 gigaton maximum is only about 25% of the fossil fuel emissions, which at the moment is 10 gigaton. So unless you find no carbon fuel sources, this is not enough to mitigate climate change. Despite all those limitations, this is something, because of other agricultural benefits, society cannot ignore. Sustainable development goals, whether it's the other land degradation neutrality, many other aspects. In addition, something which has not been mentioned is soil inorganic carbon. We only talk about soil organic carbon. Soil inorganic carbon right now, about 45% of the globe is arid and semi-arid. That area is increasing. It will be probably 50% by the end of the century. And inorganic carbon stock, not only necessarily biotic processes, but abiotic processes, secondary carbonate formation of bicarbonates and their leaching is another important component. So this humongous climate change issue does not have one solution. Nobody's saying that, but soil carbon, forestry is a natural solution with many co-benefits. They couldn't be ignored. I think that's one thing I would like to mention, which is yes, food waste, and that is where I think keep producing more, keep saying we need 50% more food by 2050, and yet we are wasting 40% of what we produce now. That makes no sense either. So I think wasting food is a crime against nature, doesn't matter how you look at it. So yes, there are many other things that need to be addressed, and the climate change and soil are intricately interconnected. Yes, it cannot solve the climate problem, but you can't ignore soil health.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Lal. So maybe just one, I know that there's this scientific consortium, the 4 per 1,000 consortium. Maybe Dr. Madari can say something about that, or Professor Lal, you're familiar with that effort to start this process going and actually implement it in countries around the world.
Maybe I can say a few words and then Dr. Madari can say. Caterpillar mill, Dr. Paulson and others from Rothamsted have been mentioned many times in this discussion, and I fully agree with his belief. I fully agree that 0.4% per year is probably not feasible. I think 1.1% per year is probably not achievable. I'm fully convinced with that. But I think here is a policymaker who adopted the concept of restoring soil carbon. And he created a slogan of Caterpillar mill. It's an aspirational slogan. And for that, I salute him for doing that. If we can achieve 0.04% or 0.1%, I think we are doing very well. And that's the way it has to be looked at. I do not look at it as something, forget it because you can't achieve it anyway. I look at it as a slogan, a positive approach, making agriculture a solution. And if he wishes to use Caterpillar mill rather than Une per mill, that's okay with me. But simply a politician is doing a positive thing. I wish there are more politicians like that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Dr. Madari, please.
Yeah, exactly as Professor Lal said, it's an aspirational goal, the 4 per 1,000. And it's very, I think the idea is very important because it brings the attention to soils and agriculture as it can be a solution for climate change. And it also gives an idea for politicians about the concept and the possibilities that it has in it. So also the 4 per mill initiative, its concept and its actions, it's based on scientific information, which is very important. But it has another very important aspect of this initiative, that it makes a connection between the different stakeholders in the globally. So it's not only for scientists, of course, it's policymakers. It has very serious work with farmers at different levels. So but not only farmers, but all the stakeholders, all the industries, for example, that are linked to agriculture. And this connection is very important so that these different stakeholders could act, could be linked together to look for a solution that is actually can be put in practice.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I can switch back for a moment just to methane. So we talked about these huge fluxes of over 500 teragrams, sinks and destruction and generation with a net. But I wanted to concentrate on this question of productivity. So if I think I understood Dr. Hill's slides correctly, the amount of milk per cow in some places is considerably different. Some cows are considerably more productive. And how much of the issue could be dealt with by greater cow productivity? If cows around the world were as productive as New Zealand cows, if I put it very directly, would that be achieve the goal stated by Professor Mitloehner, about reductions of methane.
I probably need to be clear. In our farming system, the least efficient performers on a greenhouse gas basis had the tended to have the least productivity, tended to put the most fertilizer on, and tended to have more brought-in feed, off-farm feed. The New Zealand system is not very productive compared to offshore systems. So if you use a total mixed ration system, for example, in the US, you can produce twice as much milk per animal as we produce in New Zealand, right? So, so it's only part of the productivity is only part of the picture. So you still, it's essentially the optimization of productivity within a system context that is key. I just also, well, I've just got the audience. We've got, on some of our farms, we've got 12 different soil types, just to bring about the challenge of soil organic carbon sequestration. I'm totally supportive of the concept. The devil is in the detail, which is why we've had this project running for 2 years now, international collaboration, and also in New Zealand as to how we do this. But just, I think you've got to be careful. Productivity itself doesn't necessarily improve your greenhouse gas efficiency. It's your inputs associated with that productivity as well. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Professor Mitloehner, maybe some additional comment on that? I don't know, I haven't looked specifically at California cows, but I'm sure they're very productive.
They are very productive. I mean, we produce, of course.
Is it Frank or me?
I think
if you want to go ahead, John, to ask your
okay. I just wanted to say, I mean, the 2018 special report the IPCC did on land use and climate change, that was the one that was headed up by Cynthia Rosenzweig and other people, and it was a really, really good piece of work, I think. And the problem is that the media got hold of it and the politicians got a hold of it, and they said that, you know, the problem is all these farmers, you know, it's all the emissions from the land use sector which is causing the problems. And this basically let the fossil fuel people completely off the hook, I think. And so I think we really need to, pin down where the real problem is. And the real problem, I think there are some solutions in the land use sector, but the real problem is the fossil fuel industry. And that message needs to be said very, very clearly, because they're getting a free ride at the moment. And the emphasis is being put on what the farmers and what the food system is doing, and so we need to, I think, show a few more teeth in terms of we can do a really good job here. We're working really hard to do this, but the people who are getting the free ride are the people who are digging coal and getting oil out and even methane gas from these, as Frank was showing, the one-way street. That's really the problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So yes, Dr. Mitloehner.
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. It is kind of problematic when we say a third of all greenhouse gases in the world are related to our food system, because as you know, percentages are relative numbers, and in much of the world, the entire developing world, the agricultural system is just the majority of all activities going on in these countries. And so if you then look at a global average, that global average looks very high, but it's not representative of what's happening in many regions in the world. Here in the United States, for example, agriculture is responsible for 4, animal agriculture responsible for, all of agriculture for 10, animal agriculture for 4%. That's still a sizable amount, and we need to further reduce it. But as John just said, there are people putting out smoke screens, and they are very active, they are very loud, and the public policy sector is glooming onto that. I think the agricultural sector is currently in a very defensive position, and it shouldn't be. I think agriculture, along with forestry, have a very significant solution to provide to particularly the climate puzzle, because we can not just sequester, we can also significantly reduce particularly short-lived climate pollutants, and that has a huge impact on our climate. So we can be part of a solution. That's my take-home message. I want us to get away from we're being a big problem and toward acknowledging what our contributions are on the negative side, but also what the assets are that we are providing.
Okay, well, I think so. We've come actually to the limit of our time. It's a pity because I think we could carry this discussion considerably more. And well, we don't have anyone from the fossil fuel industry. They might feel sometimes beleaguered themselves, but I think this has been a really important discussion of the role that the food supply can take to address some of these issues. The actions that are going on, and it's been a real pleasure to have such expertise discuss those very clearly and openly, and I think usefully for all the participants. So thank you again for that, and we will maybe call it to close, and hope to see you all in person one of these days after COVID will let us travel again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the chair, to the speakers, and we invite you to join on Thursday our last session on COVID-19, nutritional vulnerabilities and food supply challenges. So thank you again to all the speakers and to the co-chair. Have a nice evening or morning. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.